Welcome to 52 Drinks, 52 Weeks. And today is a very special quarantine week. We found a beverage available during this quarantine. And we have Gagan with us. I've missed you, Gagan, for the last 2 weeks. So please take it away, Gagan, and talk about Indian tonic water.
Right. So before we embark onto this topic, let me just give you a disclaimer that your heart might be broken by the end of it. Tonic water, turns out, might not be all Indian. The story begins in 1638 in Peru. A Spanish viceroy was positioned there with his wife. The lady fell ill with malaria, and the local tribesmen mentioned that if she was to put the bark of a local tree into water and drink that water, she would be cured and she'll be back on her feet in no good time. And this is precisely what happened, and she was completely cured. And she was so mighty impressed by this that she ordered a big tub, a big package of these barks to be sent back to Spain. And chances are this is how it arrived in Europe for the first time.
Well, jump 200 years from there, and the French, just around the 1860s, they've received this from the Spanish friends, and they found a way to separate the quinine from the bark and use it for various purposes. One of them was to make a tonic wine by Joseph Dubonnet that we know today as an aperitif called Dubonnet, which was drunk by the kings and queens back in the day.
But the focus never went away from South America. They were still exporting tons and tons of it. In 1860 alone, they exported about 2 million pounds of this bark just to UK and the Britain. Well, the British, of course, needed that bark because the first patented recipe of tonic water came just 2 years before that in 1858 by a person called Erasmus Bond.
And well, here's the thing. The funny thing is Peru had kind of controlled this, had a tight grip on the trade. And then a guy called Charles Ledger, very sneakily in the 1860s, he managed to get the seeds out from Peru and they gave it to the Dutch, who then took it and planted it and went crazy growing it all over, especially in Java and Indonesia. And a lot followed from there.
So much so that by the end of, by the middle or the end of the First World War in 1918, Dutch almost had a monopoly on this quinine trade. About up to 95% of the quinine of the world was coming just from Java. And of course, Java became a hotspot for every country to have its claim on. And by the end of the Second World War, Japan annexed Java, and they realized that they had to break the monopoly. And they took all of this quinine plantation and gave it everywhere, especially to Africa, which is where today the majority of quinine comes from.
But the funny thing is that when the plantation shifted to Africa, we also managed to create the laboratory version of quinine. And at which point the bark sort of became not as util anymore. You could do without it completely. So we have plantations in Africa, but you get lab quinine, which most of the commercial brands are behind working with nowadays. But Gagan, all this is fine. What was happening in India with tonic all along?
Well, the Indian love story with tonic water starts in 1825. It is said that the Indian army, the Sardars of the Indian army, were drinking a lot of quinine water. And because it was bitter, they were putting a lot of sugar and lime into it. And because it was a preventive medicinal drink, it was just generally called tonic water. Now, a lot of authors say that there is no written record about it. However, the general story is that by this time, the British army was sending a lot of their troops to India, and they were falling ill with malaria. And just again, as a preventive stuff, they said, why don't you drink it? They were carrying a lot of beer, but it wasn't traveling very well. So it was suggested to them that why don't you shift to gin? And to have their share of vitamin C, they were traveling with a lot of lemon. Now, what they were doing was they were putting a little bit of sugar, a little bit of lemon and gin together. And chances are this is the ancestral recipe of a cocktail today we call gimlet. Now dilute that with quinine water, and probably that is the origin of the true gin and tonic that started with the British Army then.
So basically, it's kind of murky there as to gin, quinine, sugar, and soda were in some way or the other always combining. So you had the gimlet or the gimlet, and then you had maybe gin and tonic come from it. But we know for a fact that the English were the richer soldiers who could afford, the higher officers could afford to have gin. For Indian soldiers, there was possibly rum, arak, or whatever they could find. So they were mixing that with their tonic. So but if it tasted as good, maybe rum and tonic and arak tonic would have also been a very popular recipe today. But what we do know is that the first bar order where you could go and have gin and tonics was in the Sialkot, I'm talking 1860, 62, where you could go for the horse races. At the end of a horse race day, you could order gin and tonics as a formal drink and you'd be served them. And that sort of is established as a drink by then.
Right. The
So,
first
yeah.
term as Indian tonic water came thanks to Schweppes in 1870. Why was it called Indian tonic water? Probably they were sourcing quinine from India. India was on the spice route, so it is still a gullible story. But what we know of it today is that Indian tonic water is a recipe, much like London dry gin. It doesn't have to be made in London anymore, but Indian tonic water is now a recipe with more amount of citrus and lesser amount of sugar.
So that's one of the types. You have Burma Tonic as well. And then, if you switch to 2000s, Schweppes was the only brand. And now there are so many other brands and flavors and styles. So I know Swami is the first Indian tonic water. I recently, during the quarantine, got some Bengal Bay. I don't know, what have you stocked with yourself?
No, I'm just doing the old school way. I'm sticking with the Schweppes Indian tonic water. Probably the suppliers are not as posh as in your area. But now tonic water is not that bitter. It does not have that much quinine. Um, it has got a lot of various flavors. People are playing with quinine from different sources. You can have tonic water with grapefruit and elderflower and berries and whatnot. So now it has become a drink that you can drink by itself. And if in case you still find it a little bitter, try adding a pinch of salt to it and see if in case it becomes a little sweeter. And don't worry about
No
drinking too
policy.
much of
Yeah.
it. It won't cure your malaria. It won't even be a preventive medicine. Rather, it can be a curse to you. There is a pathological condition now called synchronism, which by the virtue of drinking too much quinine water can actually end up having a headache, nausea, and a couple of other things. One of those things also says that your hair might fall, which definitely is not a problem in this room.
Well, I read somewhere they said that gin and tonic can cure all ailments except a hangover, and maybe synchronism as well now, as you added that to the list.
Yeah.
But lots of brands out there. So I know I can think of Swami Bengal Bay off the top of my head, and Sepoy. And now I think you've explained. So Sepoy as a history with the soldiers makes sense.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So I think
all
the
these
Sepoy
names
Mutiny of
that.
1857, the British were based out of Bengal, and that's where all the ships were coming. So probably Bengal Bay comes from there. There is fever
Fever
tree,
tree.
and we already
Yeah.
now know why it is called fever tree because it showed
Fever tree.
from the bark and everything. So I think there's a pretty interesting story about just this drink that we use as a mixer, and we never give it the due regard. We never think that it has that longer history behind it.
Well, this has been a fun video, Gagan. I'm glad we did this. This has been the first video. We're doing it in two different rooms with no drinks in
Yes.
our hand, but with a drink to be discussed.
Yeah.
So guys, let us know if you have your tonic with gin, if you have it with rum or even with cognac. Let us know how you had it, how you enjoyed it. And Gagan, thank you so much for being here. Let's do this again next week, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cheers,
Let's do that.
buddy.